Today on the 200th episode of the Perception and Action podcast, some reflections about the role of movement and variability in skill acquisition. Why is it valuable? What is good and bad variability? What is the best way to encourage good variability through practice design? So it's time for a call to action. Hi everyone. This is Rob Gray from Arizona State University and PerceptionAction.com. Welcome to the Perception and Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. Yes, as I said in the opening, this, episode number 100 of the podcast, is actually the 200th episode, just like I planned it when I started this whole crazy venture. In lieu of some sort of celebration, I thought it would take time to collect some thoughts and reflect on some of the core ideas I've emphasized over the last 199 episodes. In particular, I want to focus on something I'm kind of obsessed with at the moment: movement variability. In today's episode, I want to review some theories related to movement variability, talk about a few recent articles, discuss some recent work I've been doing on the topic, and give some practical suggestions for how coaches can harness it in practice. But before getting to all that, there's one other thing I briefly wanted to discuss. A couple weeks ago, a training video was posted on Twitter by Synaptech. In it, you have a soccer player wearing stroboscopic glasses that is standing in a room with a makeshift net against one wall. Someone off-screen is passing balls to the player, which they must control and then take a shot on goal. I commented on Twitter how much I like this activity and think it's much better than most of the simple ball drills many people are using, for a few reasons. First, there's good action fidelity. The player is controlling the ball with his chest or foot, then making a strike, just like in the real game. Second, there is variability. The passes are coming in at different lengths and directions, so the player is not just repeating the same action. Finally, an interesting twist is that a smaller than normal sized ball are being mixed in randomly. Mixing up ball size is a great example of using a task constraint to educate attention to a particular source of perceptual information. Introducing a smaller ball means that the player can't just control the timing of the action based on the distance or the size of the ball. Instead, they must use the much more robust strategy of using tau, or the rate of expansion of the ball. For me, this practice activity nicely illustrates that achieving representative design does not always require a game, full set of players, and a field. The key is preserving the specifying information and the task dynamics or action fidelity. If you haven't seen this video, I've included a link in the show notes. Okay, let's dive into the topic of the day: movement variability. Before we jump in, let's make sure we're all on the same page with regards to what type of variability we're talking about here. What I mainly want to focus on today is variability in the movement of the performer's body, their kinematics, during skill execution. So, how variable is the angle of the server's elbow from serve to serve? How variable is the timing of when a batter puts their lead foot down from swing to swing? How variable is a long jumper's foot placement as they run up to the takeoff board? This movement variability can be expressed in three main ways. First, within trial variability refers to how much a body part changes for an individual performer within a single execution. This is something I talked a lot about back in the 3-part series on Bernstein. For example, a low within trial variability could be indicative of freezing degrees of freedom. The second type is within performer variability. This refers to how much movement changes within a given performer from execution to execution. Again, this is something Bernstein talked about. For example, his famous blacksmith example shows us that it's impossible to reduce within performer variability to zero. Third, we can look at between performer variability. That is, if we compare different athletes in the same sport at the same skill level, how much do they differ in terms of their movement execution and kinematics? Before wrapping up these definitions, there are two other types of variability that are related to movement variability that need mentioning. The first is variability in the conditions of practice, which of course I discussed most recently in episode 91. A lot of variability in practice conditions is likely to promote a lot of movement variability in the performer. I'll be talking about this relationship later in the episode. Finally, there is performance outcome variability. So, for example, how variable is the direction of a serve in tennis? How variable is the speed of the ball coming off the bat in baseball? How variable is the distance a long jumper travels? Again, there are obvious links between movement and outcome variability that I'll be considering later. So today I want to try to make two key arguments. 1. Movement variability is functional, should be encouraged, and is critical for both successful skill acquisition and skill execution. In other words, it leads to better outcomes. And number 2, the amount of functional movement variability a performer exhibits is directly linked to the practice conditions you train them in. So a direct link between variability of conditions and variability of movements. Okay, so now let's work through some questions related to these points. First of all, the why. Why might movement variability have a functional role in skill acquisition? As I discussed in my mock court trial back in episode 56, our views about the role of movement variability in motor learning have changed over the years. In traditional theories of motor learning, which propose that skill acquisition involves learning some ideal technique through repetition, variability is typically conceptualized as noise. It represents deviations away from the ideal technique that a performer should try to reduce through training. This is typically done via correction by a coach. The pattern of variability that a new learner shows up with is also irrelevant to the learning process. It just all needs to be squashed as quickly as possible. On the surface, I think the general idea that acquiring a skill involves a continuous reduction in variability makes a lot of sense to a lot of people. Consistency in performance, in other words, low variability, is something that we associate with being an expert. But if we think about it, when we say consistency, we're really referring to outcome variability. Movement variability is just coming along for the ride. That is, it is being implicitly assumed that low outcome variability can only arise from low movement variability. When I first started to analyze the behavior of really skilled performers myself, this is something I expected to find too. Experts I studied would be consistently less variable in their movements as compared to lesser skilled athletes. But over the years, I realized that whether or not this is true completely depends on what type of variability you're talking about. If we just look at outcome variability, which is what most research does, then yes, I found that experts have less variance. Experienced pitchers I've studied have a smaller spread of pitch locations, golfers have a smaller spread of balls around the hole, etc. But when you look at the variability in the movement execution used to achieve these outcomes, you get a completely different story. Let me give you a few examples. In 2008, Randy Gibb and I compared the behavior of novice and expert pilots, including one expert that had over 15,000 hours of flight time. We looked at landing in different visibility conditions. We found that variability in the control of altitude when approaching the runway was actually 60% higher in experts. In the golf putting studies we've done over the years, when we look at the relationship between downswing amplitude and putting distance, there is more variance for expert golfers than lesser skilled ones. Finally, in the VR baseball training study I published last year, I found that a measure of variability in the timing of the swing was a strong predictor of performance improvement, with an increase being better. The key to understanding these effects is to go beyond just looking at the values of variability and consider its structure. So let's look at each of these in turn. In the flight example, we found that variations in the glide slope angle for experts were largest when they were a long way from the runway, and variability increased when there's poor visual information about the approach angle. In other words, this high variability was not due to a lesser ability to execute the action. Instead, the experienced pilots were deliberately acting, in this case moving the plane up and down, so as to get more perceptual information. In the golf example, experts varied their downswing amplitude more as distance changed because it's a much more effective control strategy. Experiments we and others have done have shown that club head velocity can be controlled much less precisely as compared to the amplitude. So, having a lower variability of amplitudes across distances is a control strategy that is prone to errors. Finally, in the baseball example, which I'll talk about in detail in a second, the key was isolating the quote-unquote good variability. Increasing this allowed batters to better adapt to their own individual constraints. For example, the maximum bat velocity they could produce. So, in looking at these results, we can see 3 reasons why having a relatively high amount of movement variability is important. First, moving more can create more perceptual information. This includes visual, as well as kinesthetic and haptic information. Second, having variability in one's movement allows for effective adaptation to environmental and task constraints, whether they are expected, like the distance of a putt, or unexpected. Finally, allowing and encouraging variability in movement execution leaves room for a performer to find an individual movement solution that is effective for them. Before leaving the question of why, I wanted to discuss a really interesting article published by Orth and colleagues late last year. In it, the authors examined the possible link between creativity and movement variability. The traditional view of creativity is that something that is generated in the mind. Picture the famous statue of the thinker. A novel idea is generated out of context, while the person is just passively thinking. Action is just an expression of this innovative solution that has already been fully conceived and planned in the mind. Orth and colleagues argue that this is not a good way to describe how creative actions or novel movement solutions come about. Movement solutions are emergent in the temporary couplings that exist between the individual, task, and environmental constraints. Thus, there is no primacy for the individual when it comes to generating creative actions. They are much a function of the task and the environment. So in other words, they argue that creativity in movement cannot arise from passively thinking of an action plan. Instead, it must emerge through the exploration within the constraints. Creativity in this context refers to an action that is both original, relative to what is typically performed by an individual or the comparison group, and is functional. As an example, the authors use the famous high-jumping technique of going over back first, developed by Dick Fosbury, known now, of course, as the Fosbury flop. The authors argue that Fosbury's creative solution likely emerged from him practicing different movement solutions. As evidence of this, they note that a key constraint that was changed around the same time the flop first appeared was the introduction of padded foam safety mats, which allowed jumpers to explore a wider range of solutions, including landing on the back. An important point to emphasize here is that the fact that a movement solution emerges from the interaction of constraints does not preclude the possibility that associated cognitions are developed. In other words, it is likely that Fosbury did have the thought, I think I will try going over backwards next time, before he did it. It didn't occur completely mindlessly. What the authors are arguing is that this movement solution, and the associated cognition, would never have arisen without active exploration of the perceptual motor space. In other words, Fosbury would never have come up with the flop by just sitting there staring at the bar. Another way of thinking about movement creativity is as a highly original form of adaptation to constraints, or dexterity as Bernstein called it. Constraints create a problem to be solved, which of course is the precursor to finding a novel solution. The key point of this that is relevant to my topic today is, of course, creativity can never emerge if movement variability is suppressed. If Fosbury had a coach standing next to him saying something like, "Stop rotating your shoulders, you need to go over the bar frontwards because that's the correct technique," he would have never come up with the flop. Creativity emerges through exploration of many solutions, not the repetition of one quote-unquote ideal solution. So, there are a few reasons why movement variability is beneficial: creating information, adapting to individual and environmental constraints, and creativity. But surely all variability can't be good. What distinguishes good from bad variability? Another preconception that many people have about self-organization is that it essentially involves letting the athlete flail away doing whatever they want without any input from the coach at all. This, of course, is completely incorrect. It's not that the coach does not give any input, it's that they do it in a different way, mostly through practice design, as opposed to constant movement correction. But I will get to that shortly. If you do buy the premise that allowing and encouraging movement variability is a good thing in practice, it's still important to monitor the structure of this variability. In particular, I think you need to look for two things: functionality and the potential for injury. In terms of functionality, I've been exploring using the uncontrolled manifold analysis, which I discussed back in episode 95 with some of the data from my baseball training studies. Let me try to walk you through what I've been doing. In baseball batting, the swing can be divided into distinct phases. For example, pretty much every hitter will start their swing by picking up their lead foot, the one closest to the pitcher, off the ground and then putting it back down. This is typically called the wind-up. On average, the wind-up starts at about 600 milliseconds before the instant of bat-ball contact and lasts about 300 milliseconds or so. What happens after this is usually divided into pre-swing or coiling, where the batter rotates their upper body away from the ball, and the swing, where the bat actually travels on its path. But for the purposes of this analysis, I want to just divide it into two stages: the wind-up, foot up to foot down, and the swing, foot down to point of contact. If the batter starts the action, that is, the foot up, 600 milliseconds before the point of contact, there's a functional constraint on timing. The duration of the wind-up plus the duration of the swing must add up to 600. If it's less, the batter will be too early. If it's more, they will be too late. However, as long as this 600 millisecond criterion is met, the specific duration of the two phases are free to vary. So now we can define good and bad movement variability. Bad movement variability is any change in the timing of the swing that makes the total time of the two phases not add up to 600. It's bad, of course, because it will hurt performance outcome. Good variability is any change that occurs where the total remains at 600. So, for example, if the batter switched from a 300 millisecond windup and a 300 millisecond swing to having a 280 millisecond windup and a 320 millisecond swing. This is movement within the uncontrolled manifold, and it's called quote-unquote good variability because such changes theoretically allow for more adaptability, both in terms of the individual and environmental constraints. For example, a batter that has a below-average bat speed, in other words, the swing phase will take a bit longer, can adapt by using a quicker windup. At worst, variability within the manifold will be irrelevant to performance. But is it truly functional? To address this question, I've been conducting uncontrolled manifold analyses on the data from my hitting training study I published late last year. For this, I divided up the swing into the two phases I just described and looked at how it changed from week 2 to week 6 of training, and how it varied across individuals. What have I found so far? Early in training, at week 2, there's roughly an equal amount of good and bad variability. That is, the relative timing of the two phases is varying a lot, with an equal amount taking the swing away from the 600 millisecond constraint, which I normalized all swings to, and a roughly equal amount moving along the manifold. For example, for the first batter I looked at, the variability along the manifold was roughly 19 milliseconds, while the variability orthogonal to it or away from the manifold was roughly 21 milliseconds. But now what happened after 4 additional weeks of training? The pattern was completely different. The variability along the manifold increased to roughly 27 milliseconds, while the variability away from it decreased to about 12. So good variability going up and bad variability going down. When I looked at the outcome variability, that is the variability in the timing around the desired point of contact, it was cut in half from week 2 to week 6. Therefore, what we're seeing here is the typical pattern we associate with acquiring a skill: reduction in outcome variability. But underlying it is actually an increase in good movement variability. So, at least for my data, variability along the manifold does seem to be functional. I'm still working on these analyses, and eventually I'm going to see how these relate to other performance metrics like exit velocity. So more to come soon. But in a nutshell, I believe thinking about movements in terms of ones that take you away from the goal and ones that don't is a good way to monitor the self-organization process in an athlete. Turning to the question of potential injury caused by too much movement variability, I think the concept of a movement bandwidth is a valuable one for a coach. Along the good variability axis, there needs to be some boundaries, where even though changes may be functional, they could potentially cause injury. Defining the bandwidth of acceptable variation is of course easier said than done. If we just use average ranges of motion taken from a sample, then we run the risk of limiting adaptation to a performer's individual constraints. One way that I've recently tried to approach this problem is by looking at the pattern of movement variability that is associated with injury recovery. For this, I used the data from my 2015 paper where I compared experienced batters recovering from ACL knee surgery with a comparison group that had never had knee problems. I again performed the timing uncontrolled manifold analysis. What have I found so far? The healthy batters I've looked at have essentially the same pattern as the batters at the end of the training study I mentioned earlier. That is, a larger amount of good variability than bad variability. But the pattern looks much different for players recovering from injury. They actually have a larger amount of bad variability than good variability. So in some ways, even worse than the pattern of a new learner where variability is equal in all directions. I'm still analyzing this, but it appears that the pattern is due to the fact that the variability in the timing of the wind-up is highly constrained. This is, of course, when the knee that was injured returns to the ground and the force on it really starts to increase. So I think what I'm seeing is the batter setting up their own boundaries for movement variability due to a fear of re-injury. But this is highly dysfunctional in terms of performance outcomes. In more recent studies, I've also looked at some interventions to try to correct this, so more on that coming soon. Before leaving the topic of good versus bad variability, I want to make sure not to present too much of a slanted view on this. The idea that movement variability that does not take you away from your task goal, so in other words along the manifold, is good is really just that, just an idea at this point. There have been very few studies that have tested this proposal using complex motor actions. Also, there is reason to believe that this so-called good movement variability may be harmful in some situations. For a really great discussion of the role of movement variability in skill acquisition, I highly recommend the article by Rajiv Raghunathan and Carl Newell from 2013. In it, they provide a nice framework for manipulating variability. They also discuss two situations where high movement variability in practice might be detrimental. The first is when a task involves what is called use-dependent learning. This is where learners seem to make movements that are highly similar to the previous one and build on each other. The second is in situations where some degree of coordination stability is required. For example, in a really nice study looking at a task of creating a target level of force with two hands, Raghunathan and Newell showed that having a large amount of good variability leads to worse performance when participants transfer into a condition where they receive no feedback about the results. When participants were told that they were going to have to perform in such a condition, they actually settled on one solution in training with very low variability. I'll be talking about situations where quote-unquote good variability may turn bad more in future episodes. Okay, so now we know why we might want movement variability and are starting to get a grasp on what good functional movement variability is. How do we get athletes to have it? Well, to understand this, I think it's useful to split skill acquisition up into two components: coordination and control. Coordination involves seeking out a stable movement solution, while control refers to parameterizing the relations within the coordination pattern. In reinforcement learning, these two components are referred to as exploration and exploitation. Think about trying to score when you're close to a hoop in basketball. Several different coordination solutions are possible: dunking, executing a layup, a finger roll, a short shot, or some variant that falls between these categories. Once the player has stabilized around a coordination solution, they then need to stabilize control. For example, stabilizing the relationship between the position of the ball and the extension of the legs on a dunk. Note, despite the way I've described it, these two components do not necessarily occur in a linear order, and instead seem to happen simultaneously. For example, see the study by Barros and colleagues I discussed back in episode 91. Why I think this is important is because, as a coach, I think it's critical to decide which of these two components you're going to emphasize in a practice design. Do I want my athlete to explore a large range of movement solutions, or is the one they have effective and I want them to help optimize control? For example, think about using a constraints-led approach to coaching basketball. If we want to encourage the development of coordination, we might systematically increase the distance from the hoop. This is likely to lead to a large reorganization in the nature of the action. From something like a one-handed layup close to the hoop, to a two-handed set shot further away, to a two-handed jump shot from behind the three-point line. Here we are encouraging the player to explore good variability and coordination. That is, changes in the amount of force supplied by each arm, the hands, and the lower body, etc. to the shot. Imagine now that the player has found a movement solution for shooting that is effective for them. Hopefully I've convinced you by now that for almost all sports we can't stop here, because you can't just have one movement solution and be successful. You need to be able to adapt it to the ever-changing conditions. Developing this adaptability is what exploring and stabilizing control is all about. Returning to basketball, a way that this could be achieved would be to manipulate the lateral position of the shooter relative to the basket, or add some obstacle that they must shoot over. Because the distance to the hoop is not changed, this is unlikely to require a change in coordination solution. Instead, the player must learn to make small adjustments to it, to account for the change in the position of the body relative to the hoop and the obstacle. Reganathan and Newell have termed this exploration of execution redundancy. It should also be pointed out here that in most cases, the goal should not be to find just one coordination solution and work on its control. Instead, we should be aiming for multiple stable coordination and control solutions. This, of course, results in an increase in degeneracy, giving an athlete multiple options for ways to solve movement problems. So, in a nutshell, by manipulating task and environmental constraints, of course in a manner appropriate for an athlete's individual constraints, we can influence the exploration of coordination and control solutions. In terms of some more specifics on how to achieve good variability, I have been running some studies directly comparing different coaching methods for this. The first one comparing constraints and cueing, which I mentioned back in episode 89, should be coming out soon. More recently, we have been collecting data comparing differential learning and the constraints-led approach. For this, we've been training batters to hit the ball to the opposite field, so to right field if you're a right-handed batter. Batters in the differential learning group are trained by having to swing from lots of different initial body positions. Closed stance, open stance, front foot back, front foot forward, hands up, hands down, etc. Batters in the constraints group are not told anything about how to position their body, but instead must hit in conditions where foam obstacles are placed around the plate that they must avoid. What have I found so far? The use of constraints seems to result in both better performance and a larger increase in the good variability of swing timing. More on this coming soon. By the way, in case you're interested, I've posted all of my baseball batting papers, and will continue to add the new ones, in a Google Drive folder. If you would like the link, please drop me an email. Okay, that's the why, what, and how. Now when? At what points in the training cycle should we be pushing athletes to have large amounts of movement variability and explore, and which points should we be stepping back and letting them try to be more consistent and stabilize? This, of course, is part of the larger issue of periodization of skill acquisition that I discussed back in episode 91, which I think is going to continue to be a rich area of exploration. I've yet to investigate anything where the timing of variability manipulations is compared myself, but I have found some interesting things by looking at the pattern of data from the large training study I published last year. To refresh your memory, batters in the main group in my study trained for 6 weeks, following an adaptive training method, where the variability in conditions, pitch speeds, pitch locations, and pitch types, was adjusted based on their performance, using a staircase methodology. In the training, speed was adjusted first, then location, then type. Well, to try and explore the question of when, I went back and looked at whether I could see anything in the patterns of the adaptive changes across the 6 weeks. What have I found? Interestingly, there seems to be a link between the ratio of good to bad variability for each hitter at the start of training, which I calculated using the uncontrolled manifold analysis I discussed earlier in today's episode, and the pattern of changes across time. Batters with a relatively low ratio of good to bad variability in timing took longer to stabilize in terms of pitch speed. That is, they took several staircases to find a speed at which they could stabilize performance. To me, this suggests that they were still looking for a good coordination solution in terms of the basic swing timing. Conversely, for batters with a relatively high ratio of good to bad variability, the staircase for speed stabilized much more quickly, and they moved on to variations in pitch location earlier. This could be interpreted as exploring different control solutions for a stabilized coordination pattern. Although this is somewhat tentative, I think there's some interesting things here. The basic idea that the structure of variability at the start of training determines the rate and pattern of skill acquisition is also consistent with a study of hand movements published by Wu and colleagues in 2014. Link in the show notes. But the broader message from this is that the rate at which movement variability should be encouraged is not likely to fit with some periodization schedule based on a fixed time period. Instead, it needs to be performance-based, individualized, and is likely to be pretty nonlinear. To sum up, today we looked at the important role of movement variability in skill acquisition, discussing its critical role in developing adaptive and creative movement solutions, how good and bad variability can be separated, and how and when good variability can be encouraged using different coaching methods. As I mentioned, this is a topic I'm fairly obsessed with at the moment, so watch for a lot more coming soon, including my presentation at the Sport Movement Skill Conference in April. As a summary of one of the main points I want to make today, I will use a quote from the Reganathan and Newell article I mentioned earlier. Quote, "Does introducing movement variability during practice facilitate learning? In our view, this question does not have a simple yes or no answer. We propose that it's important to move away from the notion of considering variability as a single construct and using the associated umbrella term variable practice, because introducing movement variability during practice can influence learning in multiple ways through multiple mechanisms." End quote. To move this idea forward, we have to look more at the structure of variability and how it's influenced by different instructional methods. So what are the take-home messages for coaches from today's episode? Well, hopefully I've convinced you that allowing your athlete to explore movement solutions by being variable in their skill execution can be a highly effective way to develop skills that will be well suited for the individual, adaptable, and transferable in the long run. I've had some interesting discussions on Twitter lately with coaches that are skeptical about this idea, which of course is totally okay, and I like because it helps me clarify my thinking and generate new research ideas. The skeptics will often say things like, "You have to know your ABCs before you can learn to write," or "Would you try to teach calculus by just putting a student in front of the board without teaching them basic arithmetic first?" At the heart of both of these comments is, of course, the traditional idea that we need to teach a basic set of ideal movements first, through repetition and error correction, with the goal of reducing variability, before you can become elite at a sport. Well, I would point out a couple things. First, these examples, learning ABCs in math, are both highly cognitive skills that require learning a lot of undisputable facts. As a new learner, I'm not free to come up with my answer to what is 2 plus 2, or which letter comes first in the alphabet. But this type of learning is completely different than learning perceptual motor skills. The latter does not necessarily require the buildup of lots of declarative facts, and the athlete is free to come up with their own unique solutions. Think back to the example of Dick Fosbury I mentioned earlier. He essentially decided that in high jumping, 2 plus 2 now equals 5. For a more relatable example, think about how you learned to run. Did someone make you do a bunch of repetitive drills before you started? Okay, here's how you plant your foot. Here's how you exchange your weight during a stride. No, not likely. You learn these things by doing them in the face of ever-changing constraints, running over rough terrain, trying to catch people that were faster than you, etc. So if you're skeptical about the idea of self-organization and variability in practice, and like to teach a lot of basic movements through repetitive drills, I would at least suggest trying to add a little variation and see what happens. Okay, assuming that you do accept the general idea that movement variability is good, how do you encourage it in practice? Well, I think the first step as a coach is to clearly and deliberately decide what bad variability is for the particular skill you're training. What is the bandwidth of movement outside of which you feel there's a good chance of injury? What are movement patterns that result in bad variability? That is, taking an athlete away from their performance goal. Whether you define these formally using something like uncontrolled manifold analysis, or more informally by watching video, for me, it's critical that you predefine what you're looking for and track that when you're watching an athlete. Everything else, just let it be. Observing an athlete as a coach needs to be a deliberate, intentional process. Without that, it's easy to fall into the trap of reacting to any little variation and feel like you always have to step in. Finally, if you feel that there's some mechanical pattern that is an absolute must for all your athletes, for example, a batter's front foot must be open when they swing, I would highly encourage you to really test and retest this idea. Look at what elite athletes do. Is there any variation in this pattern at all? There are very few 2 + 2 has to equal 4s in movement solutions. And the ones that do exist will likely be expressed in the individual constraints which will shape the athlete's movement without you having to give them the answer. Okay, that's it for today's episode. And just an FYI, there will be no episode next week as it's my spring break. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or follow me on Twitter at ShakyWeights. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials, including an extra monthly episode, please head over to patreon.com/perceptionaction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep 'em coupled.